Hello, first grade. I hope you all are doing well and hope you're enjoying the spring weather we've been having. Miss Fromuth told me that you guys are going to be reading the book Frog and Toad in reading class here pretty soon. And so I thought it'd be appropriate to give you a lesson on frogs and toads. I was also told that you were given a reading packet, and in that reading packet there's a little chart or table in which you can fill out some background information on frogs and toads. Things like where they live, what they eat, what they look like, and other things about frogs and toads. And I'm going to be talking about all of those things in this video here. So you might want to get that packet out and you can fill in that information as I say the things. And you can of course pause the video if you need to have some extra time to write stuff down. So I hope you're going to enjoy Frog and Toad. It's a great book. I actually read it not too long ago myself. Have fun with that. And it'll be even more fun if you know what frogs and toads are and how they're similar and how they're different. Now, here's a bunch of pictures. Some of these critters are frogs, and some of these critters are toads. And I'm betting that not all of you would be able to pick which ones are the frogs and pick which ones are the toads. And so that's part of what we're going to be talking about today. But notice how they look very, very similar. And that's because they're very similar types of animals, frogs and toads. And so before we talk about how frogs and toads are different, I want to tell you some ways that they are similar to each other. So these are things that they have in common. So the first thing that they have in common is they are both amphibians. Now that's a big word, and basically that means that they're born as tadpoles, and they spend the first part of their life in the water. So their childhood time is spent as a tadpole, and they actually breathe the water during that time. And after they're a tadpole for a little while, they start to grow legs and they lose their tail, and then they can hop out on land, and then they can breathe air. So amphibian actually comes from a word that means kind of they can breathe both, or they can go between water and land. They're amphibious in that way. But here's a nice picture for you of the life cycle of a frog, and this is what the life cycle of a toad looks like as well. Notice they start out as little eggs, and these eggs look almost like little balls of jelly with a dot in the middle. And then when the eggs hatch, they turn into a tadpole. And the tadpole looks an awful lot like a fish, and they're quite similar to fish, but they are not fish, because they start growing legs, and they start to look more and more like a frog, and their tail eventually disappears, and they become a full-grown frog. And then, in some time, that frog will lay more eggs, which will become tadpoles again. And so that's how it's a life cycle, because you go from a frog to an egg to a tadpole to a frog, and then back to an egg. So you can keep going through that cycle, and all living things have a life cycle. So remember, this applies to both frogs and toads. Also, frogs and toads are both carnivores. So this describes what they eat. Now, the word carnivore just means that they eat meat. So they don't eat vegetables and flowers and grass and all that. They eat other creatures. So one of their favorite things to snack on are bugs. But sometimes if frogs and toads get large enough, they'll eat other small animals. Like they might even eat small mice or other frogs if they're big enough. But bugs are what they usually stick with. So you'll see them eating worms and flies and things like that. Now what's really fun about frogs and toads is they have these neat little sticky tongues that they can actually shoot out of their mouth and capture their prey with. So down here in the bottom right you can see a tree frog. It looks like he's hanging on a glass window. He's not flying. And he is catching a moth with his long sticky tongue. That way frogs can grab bugs right out of the air. Also here on the left we have a toad who is eating a little mealworm, it looks like, something like that. He's sticking his tongue out to get it. It'd be kind of fun if we could eat that way, although it'd probably be bad table manners to be eating by sticking our tongue out. Alright. Now, we're going to get into the ways that frogs and toads are different. The first difference that we're going to talk about is the way they look. So frogs and toads appear different. I have right here labeled a frog and a toad. The frog is on the left and the toad is on the right. And you can pause the video and see if you can think of a couple ways that they are different in the way that they look. So I'm going to go ahead and share some of the things that I see when I look at the differences between frogs and toads. One of those differences is that frogs are often more of a greenish color, and toads are often more of a brownish color. So that's not always the case, But if something is green, it's more likely to be a frog than a toad, and if something is brown, it's usually going to be more toad-like, or more of a toad than a frog. So that's the biggest difference that I see just at a glance. But then if you start to look closer at them, a couple other things that you might notice is that toads usually have bumpier skin than frogs. And the toad's skin actually, if you ever feel them, they actually feel dry. Whereas toads, their skin is usually a little more smooth. It's not as bumpy, although there are bumps on it. And it's often more wet. So frogs are kind of wet and smooth, kind of, you can almost think of slimy-like. And toads tend to be a little drier and bumpy. So that's a second difference in the way they look. A third difference in the way they look, and you can't see this very well in this picture right here, but frogs usually have bigger legs than toads. So notice these great big back legs of this frog. I'm moving my mouse over them right now. Toad legs usually aren't quite as big, and so toads can't hop quite as far as frogs can. It's just the way they're made. So the toad's leg is going to be a little bit shorter, so he can't hop quite as far. Now, other ways that frogs and toads are different is that they live in different places. So, I didn't label which of these is the frog and toad. We're going to use what we just looked at, the ways they look different from each other, to identify which of these is the frog and which is the toad. And then we'll describe the places that they live in. So, take a moment and see if you can figure out which of these is the frog and which of these is the toad. Now here's the answer. The frog is the one on the left. Notice how it's a green color, and notice how its skin is really smooth and it looks a little bit slimy. That's a good identification of it being a frog. And on the right here, this critter over here, he's got brown, bumpy skin. And his back legs don't look too big, although we can't compare them to the other guy because his are underwater. But this is a toad over here on the right with the brown, bumpy skin. Now, how are the places they live different from each other? You'll notice that the frog is living in water over here, in a bunch of lily pads. And the toad looks like he's on some rocks. He's on dry land on the ground. And so that's the biggest difference between where they live. Frogs like to live in the water, and toads like to live on the ground. And that actually explains some of the difference in their colors. If frogs are hanging out in lily pads, being green helps them camouflage with the lily pad, makes it so that they blend in with their background, making them harder to see. Notice how the frog almost looks like another lily pad. And the toad, being bumpy and brown, he looks more like the rocks and dirt that he's going to be staying on land. So that helps him camouflage or blend in to the background so that he's harder to spot. Notice how he almost looks like he's made of a bunch of little rocks and dirt. It looks like he's kind of pebbly. So, that is all the information I have on frogs and toads for you right now. I hope it's a good bit of background information for your reading adventure you're about to go on with frog and toad. So go ahead and fill out that chart in your reading packet, and I hope that you enjoy the story. Take care.